Hello, Internet, and welcome to episode 65 of the Deep Fried Neurons podcast. Today, we're not doing as much, we're doing a little bit of story time, jumping across timelines, and we're exploring the idea that humans don't like the idea of human agency not being a contributive factor to how history is recorded. And also, we're talking about a bunch of diseases. So, yeah, have fun listening to it, and I'll cue the fucking. Good morning, everyone. I haven't slept much, which is why this I might sound sleepy in this podcast, which is fine. And I mean, my sleeplessness aside, today we're talking about something you've read in the title and has been trending in the news for a while, which is quite the topic of interest currently. Like I've been obsessing over it for about 2 days. Speaking of which, please take care of yourself. Wash your hands. Avoid touching your face, gargle regularly, and if you show symptoms of, well, the disease that has been on everybody's mind forever, please go to a doctor and talk to them, get yourself checked or whatever. I think the dangerous symptoms are dry cough and fever, and after that it turns into like a pneumonic attack. Anyway, getting down to what we're talking about today is something that makes most people uncomfortable and is surprisingly has very little written about it when you're talking about in historical perspective. We're talking about disease, and my focus today is on pandemic diseases that actually traveled everywhere and where had a cultural impact, if not a numbered impact on everything. Well, if it's unclear to you, I'm pretty sure that diseases have had a very significant role in shaping history the way it is. And of course, one of the reasons why we don't talk about diseases in our historical records is because it has been a long-lived perception of the human species, which is a little hubris, some people would say, that human agency is the major contributing factor to human history. And that's not necessarily true. Cosmic horror has a lot stronger overtones when it comes to, well, history and the way human species will be recorded. Remember that we will not be around to document our own end. Most likely. I mean, though that is the possibility. But beyond that, whatever sparse information I've found over the history, I will give it to you and you, well, let me know if that helped you or that was interesting. So, the reason I say that history has had a disease has had a fundamental difference to make in history is because there was a time when diseases in specific were our primary problem in forming civilizations. Civilization, as you know, is speculated to be formed in the tropics, most widely speculated to be formed in the tropics in Africa, and tropics in general are known to be home to a lot of microparasites and a lot of life. And when life is competitive, that means more people die more frequently, specifically by disease. Some soulless, some soulless tiny speck of dust which has some resemblance to life will enter your body through an insect bite, like a mosquito bite, and it will end you. And that's how things used to be until we outgrew those diseases or learned to survive them, or even better, just moved out of the tropics and went to, well, different places which were less frequent to get diseases in, or less populated by those microparasites that help those diseases breed. And once we formed civilization, a new problem arose that not all diseases required the contact of a parasite. Some of them were enough for something to be contaminated in the air, or water to just sit still, and two animals form just the right conditions for a certain kind of virus or a certain kind of bacteria to come along. And that's how diseases usually spread. And when civilization was made, it was mostly made in the valleys near the rivers, which meant that storing water was a bright idea that a lot of people got at the time, which meant, well, there's going to be disease coming from those waters. And a lot of it wasn't recorded very well. It was just said to be died of disease was a description for a very long time. But this died of disease was a very significant contribution even before we started counting centuries as we do, like before the birth of Christ, as is recorded and strongly disputed. Not strongly disputed, actually. It's not, historically, it's not disputed at all. But the effect, anyway, what we're talking about is disease. So, I think his name is Titus Linus Linavius or something like that. He was a historian with the Romans, and he used to, document what was happening. He traveled with the Roman army for every war that they went to, and near about 11 epidemics is what he recorded. That sort of brings me to my next point, that war has inevitably been linked to disease in our culture, because you go from one place to another. The parasites that are in your body are completely comfortable in different temperatures, and when you pass them on to other people, they sort of react very differently and sometimes very violently, which causes epidemics in certain places, which is why gangrene has been traveling with the Chinese army since forever. And it has been a trend that you will see where war happens and war brings diseases, because war also leaves back dead bodies. Open decomposition is the breeding ground for pathogens, which means that civilization nearby will get affected, especially if if those dead bodies lose water and they decompose in the puddle of that water. And altogether, well, it's gonna cause a lot of problems. Now, I've not taken disease names yet because I'm building to it. I'm just attributing how diseases might spread. And the second one, of course, is trade and commerce, because live carriers are better at interacting with live people than dead people are. So when the trade of spices from India to Arabia started somewhere in the 9th or the 8th century, and the Silk Road kicked in into its effect of traveling with goods, and the Europeans used to collect their goods from Arabians across the Mediterranean, or Persians across the Mediterranean. That's when diseases used to spread from live person to live person. Not to mention, ships were also houses to all kinds of rodents, and this information will be key for something we're going to discuss very soon, actually, in the next sentence. Now, it is long been speculated, and to some people even confirmed, that the 14th century plague, the one that hit its peak in about 1349, that the number is disputed, was a result of infected rats traveling onto Mediterranean ships from Persia, which were actually gotten from live carriers that traveled all the way across from China. There is a lot of historical record interpreted by historians, which sort of suggests that the Silk Road was the major reason why the bubonic plague, as it did affect Europe, traveled from China. What a coincidence. I mean, China's also a fair bit of South China is in the tropics, so it makes sense why that would happen. And here's where I'd like to explain a minor distinction that's not necessarily contextual. It is contextual, actually. That's not necessarily helping all other information. Bubonic plague, or bubonic, is characteristic swelling of the lymph nodes, which is what caused the swellings that were so distinctly recognizable for the Black Plague. And then pneumonic plague is, of course, a respiratory problem, and pneumonia is what you understand, and pneumonic symptoms is how you die. We'll come back to that. So the bubonic plague is a great marketing strategy with the name Black Death. I don't know who came up with it, but I remember A British lady named it in 1910 or 1912 while recording the history of the 14th century. And the Black Death had a significant impact on the world culture in general. Not that death and disease were not everywhere else. To be honest, at least the Ayurvedic studies that have been recorded in the Indian kingdom show that diseases have always been around, and I genuinely believe that modern medicine would be better. What a controversial opinion, right? Modern medicine would be better at dealing with diseases than old medicine. And for some reason, the necessity for contribution of human agency in human history was so necessary in India that there's not a lot of reliable record of disease. But there is a lot of reliable record of medical sciences. For example, the surgical instruments that are used widely today were developed or written about by a man named Sushrut, who is popular in naming all kinds of hospitals in the country. And well, the British took a lot of those manuscripts and provided that kind of literature for surgery to be where it is and anesthesia to be where it is. Besides the point, Black Death. So the 14th century Black Death sort of shaped our imagination of history to this day. To be honest, all epidemics are compared to the Black Death. I think John Green, when he was talking about disease in his Crash Course History videos, I think I saw it a few years ago, that episode. He was talking about how if Black Death was a band, it would be the Beatles. And that's true. I would say, like, I would make this analogy. If Black Death was a military dictator, it would be Hitler, because that's the kind of historical impact it has captured. That's the kind of fear it captured. So in the 14th century, when people started to die right, left, and center in the streets, and the doctors used to wear masks to go treat the affected, Black Death was all across Europe. I think it claimed about 3% of all the world's population just in Europe. And of course, it traveled all across Persia. Its origin, like I said, has been speculated to be in China, and there are records to suggest that it traveled to India during the Mauryan reign, not the Mauryan reign, the Mughal reign, in the Adil Shahi territories. And the Black Death first epidemic lasted right up till the middle of the 14th century, because, well, modern medicine wasn't as developed, and a lot of people died. As a result of which might actually have contributed to the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation, because the church was particularly ineffective in dealing with the plague, at least stopping the death, or even providing comfort to the ones who were dying and the people who were witnessing the death. A lot of historical records show a descent into hedonism, as if it's a bad thing, but a descent into hedonism in Europe during this time. And this won't be the last time we see the Black Death, because the recent epidemic that we had of Black Death was in 1720, which is the one that sort of captured the imagination of people again. And I think this was more continental than it was before, because Britain was affected in the first one majorly, and then it traveled to continental Europe. But the 1721 started in a town in France. The name of the town starts with an M. I forget the name. And it sort of bred there, and then it caused just as amount of death. And the Black Death this time, the bubonic plague this time, claimed quite a lot of lives. And contrary to popular belief, this was not the last time that we saw an outbreak of the bubonic plague, because there was an outbreak in India in 1994. I don't remember which region, might have been Madhya Pradesh, where 52 people died in the epidemic of bubonic plague or Black Death. And I think San Francisco had one in the early 70s or earlier, where 115 people died of the bubonic plague. Now, let's leave the bubonic plague behind and move ahead in history, because this is where it starts to get weird. Then we have 1820, the Spanish flu, which also went pandemic and claimed quite a few lives, but it was not known by the same name everywhere. And of course, it didn't have the cultural impact that the Black Plague had. And to be honest, it wasn't taken as seriously. The death count it created was nowhere near. And of course, then the 1920s cholera epidemic, which is fresh in people's history more than anything else. The cholera epidemic lasted for about a decade. That's how frequent it was. And to be honest, cholera outbreaks are not uncommon even now. Just when the cholera outbreaks happened in 1920s, they were unheard of, and we were not prepared for it. But in the less privileged parts of the world, cholera still claims quite a few lives. Speaking of which, a friend of mine, I'm not gonna dox him because I know you guys are smart and you'll find him. He put up an Instagram story which I couldn't help agree with, that coronavirus, I mean, while it is quite a dangerous situation, would not have been half a big deal if it was in Africa. And I couldn't help but agree, because Africa has quite a long record of cholera outbreaks, tuberculosis outbreaks. Not to mention, they had two different viruses affecting their health in the 2000s. I think 2016 is when Zika virus happened, and about 2 years before that we had Ebola, and of course swine flu also originated there. And we'll talk about more diseases in the future which originated in Africa. Cholera, again, known to travel over the Silk Road, but unclear where it was started. But then there was an entire century in the middle of diseases. The 70s had an AIDS epidemic, which was a virus brought about by the interaction of chimpanzees and humans. Now, I know it's an STD, but it did go endemic. In the 70s, the disease was endemic. And thank you to the WHO and and even NACO for NACO to get awareness out about this disease and talk about healthy sexual practices that actually stopped AIDS in its tracks from extending human civilization. Now, it is speculated that AIDS as a disease was born in chimpanzee culture in Africa, and then it was transferred to a host which traveled all across. Not one hosts from there. But there have been quite a few diseases that originate from Africa and don't leave from there because of, well, the way global economy is structured. Until 1994, South Africa was still in apartheid. And there's a few papers that I would like to suggest that everyone reads, which are a little controversial, but I think would provide a little perspective on a little phenomenon called neocolonization. So neocolonization sort of talks about how countries like Congo have been taken over by mining mafia, or mining companies that ship all across the west and a few parts of the east. How DiBiase have managed to keep the labor in these countries to be completely unprivileged. And it's really a grim scene to see how and why they have been structured the way they are, and how the economics of it has stopped diseases from spreading from Africa. But China, on the other hand, is a completely different story. Now, I'm pretty sure everybody's seen the Vox video. If you haven't, I'm going to leave a link in the description. It's very informative. The new virus is not new at all. We've had H1N1, which is swine flu, also originated in Africa. It was transferred by consumption of pigs, who were the primary host for that virus. Then there was SARS, SARS. I think it's a systematized acute respiratory syndrome or something like that. I don't know what the S stands for. That was dumb. I'm gonna leave it in the cut because I wanna show people how dumb I am and how relatable I am. But I think it was called SARS, SARS, and it was also developed in a wet market in China, somewhere further down south. And the way wet markets work, and the reason they came about, is because in the 70s there was a great famine in communist China, and they were struggling to give their people food. So they promoted for private wildlife farming and private wildlife hunting for consumption of meat all across the board, so that in these pockets of world you can eat whatever you want because there's nothing more to eat. And eventually it was incentivized because the way modern markets work, they will sort of promote all amounts of institutionalization of circulation of goods. And well, what happens because they're stacked in cages, right? So on the top of the cages there's an animal, below that there's an animal, below that there's an animal, and whenever there's blood, pus, excreta that the animals on the top create, they go all the way down, and the bottom feeder sort of, if he's already sick, so those all of that pus, blood and excreta sort of will form the ideal conditions for the viruses to breed, and then if they're consumed by this animal, it'll further go down that chain. Now, all of us have made memes about how bats are the primary source, but there is another host in the middle that then transferred the disease to humans. And the first 40 cases that were shown of coronavirus, 27 of them were visitors to Wuhan who had gone out. And let's be fair, wildlife consumption for food is not for the commoners, if you catch my drift. It's for the 1% of the 1%, because I don't know what part of the world you're from, but certain meat is associated with a certain kind of class, and that's the case everywhere. So meat consumption for the wildlife animals sort of is breeding the current virus as well. Now, unlike SARS, coronavirus has actually gone pandemic. SARS, during its time, claimed 882 lives after, I think, traveling to 71 countries, India being one of them. Bird flu has a similar case. So this was a good time to delve into how disease has been across the board. I hope you found this informative. Thank you. Okay, that's all I have for you this week, and I hope you enjoyed that. There will be more episodes this week because, well, college has been suspended and I have quite a lot of time. My other project has also been stopped in its tracks because it involves interaction with humans, and I'm a little sad that has happened, but that's okay. We can get through sadness together. So I am hoping to do a lot more episodes this month in particular. I hope you enjoy the kind of content I make, and if you do, please consider supporting my Patreon. If not, at least like, share, subscribe. Wow, I'm not kidding. There are utensils being thrown in the street. I have no idea what the context for this is, but I am very curious. Somebody's interjecting, so I'm in no hurry. So as I was saying, like, share, subscribe. Even that helps. Let your friends know about this podcast. Share it shamelessly, and I'll see you in the next